Good morning, everyone. Yeah, my name's Ben Smart. Thanks to Leanna and thanks to Gary from the Tanyptera project for asking me to talk to you today. It's going to be an introduction to the wide variety of field signs that allow us to detect the presence of Micro-Lepidoptera and in many cases to identify the species responsible. I'll look at a wide variety of species, types of signs and the feeding methods that are used. Where possible, and illustrate this with field signs that can be found around now. So if anyone's inspired and perhaps the weather's a little bit kinder, you should be able to get out into the field perhaps tomorrow and record some of these without too much trouble. Okay, so to start, what are micro-moths? That's a basic question. Within Lepidoptera, there's about 2,500 UK species, and 2/3 of them fall into the group traditionally been termed micro-moths. There's not really too much scientific basis on the split between micro-moths and macro-moths. The families that form the micro-moths are traditionally seen as perhaps the evolutionarily more primitive ones. They tend to include smaller moths, but absolutely this is not 100%. Some large moths in the micro-moth groupings and some pretty tiny moths in the macro-moth groupings. But certainly the very smallest moths, like the Nepticulid leaf miners, measuring wingspan of 3 to 4 millimeters, are found within the micro-moth group. So these photos show some examples of micro-moths. You know, all of them are reasonably common, and in one particular case becoming a lot commoner. And they do show the variety within them. The first one in the top left shows the white plume moth, Pterophorus pentadactyla. It's quite a decent sized micro-moth with a wingspan of about 30 millimeters. The larvae feed on convolvulus bindweeds, and that's really fantastic looking species. Top right is something called Phalaenoptera strigulatella, which is a leaf miner, uses grey alder leaves, and that's a pretty small moth with a wingspan of about 7 millimeters. Going around clockwise below that, bottom right, is something called a 20 plume moth or many plumed moth, Elucita hexadactyla, whose larvae feed in the sort of trumpet flowers of honeysuckle during late spring. And then bottom left is a beautiful moth, Cydia perspectalis. Who wouldn't love this? Maybe people with box hedges, because it's also the box tree moth, which is spreading at a rate of knots through the country. There's main records from Cheshire and lots of adult records from Lancashire, possibly further north. So, yeah, but blame the plant importers rather than the moth itself. The moth's just doing what it knows best. Okay, so I suppose this gets us on to why record micro-moth field signs. Well, you know, some micro-moths are easily attracted to a moth trap, but others are pretty hard to record in this way. So field signs can be really useful. They're hard to record at a moth trap because some micro-moths don't actually travel far from their specialized habitat. Some aren't really all that attracted to light. And there's even a few species where the moth, or at least the female moth, is wingless. And so it's certainly not going to fly and end up in your trap. So recording micro-moth field signs certainly allows us to record a much greater range of species than waiting hopefully by the trap would do. And if the record proves that breeding takes place at a particular location, that's probably a more valuable record. Gives us greater understanding, therefore, of the biology of a species. So not just looking at one stage of the moth's development, but the whole thing. Hopefully it's an enjoyable activity in itself. You know, you can get out into all sorts of habitats. It's peaceful, relaxing, and you can go very slowly. I mean, if you cover 100 yards in half, you're having a bad time. You're not finding much. So you go nice and slow, and it's something you can look for these really in all weathers. I mean, it's not very nice today, but if I wanted, I could go out and find plenty of species now. Sorry, my phone went off. And yeah, something you can look for these at all times of year. So here we've got some stem miners of Myelois, circumvoluta, Mompha, sturnipennella in a gall, Graphilita finibrana, top right in a slow. In the middle left, we've got the spinning on sallow of Anacampsis populella. lots of larvae from Micro-Lepidoptera form leaf mines, and in the centre is one mining reed canary grass, something called Elachista maculae keracella. Middle right is one of the many species that form a case to protect the larva, and this one's Coleophora discordella, which feeds on birds' foot trefoils. Bottom left, one of the catkin feeders, in this case Epinotia immeundana. There's even a few moths whose larvae feed underwater, and the example in the bottom centre is the small China moth, Cataclystra lemnata. And then in the bottom right, one of the species that forms a cocoon under bark and can be found during the winter, and this one's Pameni regiana, a tortoisid that forms its cocoon under flaky sycamore bark. So micro-moth field signs in general ways, it's evidence that a moth's present, or in some cases, such as the gall on Rosebay Willowherb that's in the top centre, evidence that the moth has been present. Therefore, empty stems, empty leaf mines, empty larval cases, they can all be used to record a moth, even when the larva's gone. So typically, this involves searching for some abnormal signs in the appearance of a plant caused by the activity of Micro-Lepidoptera larvae. So, like these examples, I'm going to look at various feeding methods, show the sort of signs to look for and what species might be responsible. Of course, it's just an introduction. There's about 1,600 micro-moth species, and each will have feeding techniques and therefore field signs associated with it. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to look at stems and twigs and some of the creatures that will cause the feeding signs that can be found here. The species on the left is a small micro-moth, about 4 to 5 millimeters in length, Glyphipterix simpliciella, the larvae of which feed in the flowers and seeds of cocksfoot grass during late summer. The larvae then travel down the stem and all these little holes into the stem. Over winter, the stem becomes hardened and woody, and you can easily see these little holes. If you open up the stem, you'll find some green larvae inside in white papery cocoons. They're very easy to rear. Just look at cocksfoot grass, and see these tall stands. And any afflicted stems will have these small holes in. Just collect a few of those, stick them in a pot, and wait for spring, and hopefully the adults will emerge. The other two moths featured on there both mine the stems of broom, so you can find them on broom twigs, and they form a black gallery. So there's like a mine just beneath the surface of the plant. The photo in the middle shows Trifurcula immeundella, and this one has a black egg at one end of the mine. The one on the right is Leucoptera spartifoliella. I haven't pictured the mine of that, but that doesn't have the egg, so that's one way of separating the two. The one on the right, Leucoptera spartifoliella, when the larva leaves its mine, it forms this white cocoon on the twigs, so that's another way of recording the species. And if you pot up some of those cocoons, then you can get the adults that's pictured below. That's quite a beautiful species. Other species that feed in stems, there's not always external evidence of their presence, and these three are examples, all pretty common species to be honest, but not much in the way of external evidence, especially at this time of year. I think in all these cases the larva will make a little exit hole just prior to pupation, so that's probably not going to appear until March or April. On the left is Epiblema scutulana, whose larvae feed in the stems of creeping thistle. In the middle is Myelois circumvoluta, the thistle ermine, whose larvae feed in stem thistles. And on the right, there's actually a couple of species, both from the Tortrix family. The one at the bottom, the pink larva, is Epiblema costipunctana. This shows a ragwort stem. Epiblema costipunctana feeds right down at the bottom of the stem, going into the rootstock, and ejects its frass through a hole in the side of the stem. Up above that is the smaller pale larva of Cochylis atricapitana, actually it's one of these that's recently changed its name. Can't remember its new name, but anyway, Cochylis atricapitana is what it'll say in all the books. And this species differs in that you can see all its frass is still there within the stem, all packed in behind it. That larva stays within the stem, pupates in the stem, and the adult emerges through the exit hole that gets created sort of at the start of spring. Whereas the one down at the bottom, Epiblema costipunctana, that leaves the ragwort stem around sort of October and then pupates in the leaf litter in spring. So if you open a ragwort stem, you might find the Cochylis larva, but the Epiblema costipunctana larva should be long gone. So the point of these, none of them really have much external signs. So it really is just a question of finding some dried stems and opening them at random. All the common species, so it shouldn't actually take too long before you come across one of them. Okay. So these species that I'm going to talk about now all form galls in the stems, so their presence is really quite obvious, and the gall takes the form of a swelling, usually at a leaf node, and generally with a hole right in the middle of it, firstly to allow the larva to eject frass from the stem, and secondly to allow the moth to emerge at a later date. And these 4 shots all show the life cycle of the Hemp-agrimony Plume. The photo in the top left is a gall where the larva is actively feeding. So this would have been taken in late summer, and that's the larva there, obviously on the top right. Down on bottom left is a gall stem that you can find around now on Hemp-agrimony. I'm really sure. Anyway, you should be able to find that around now. And it's still really obvious, and the larva will still be in there. It pupates in spring with the adult emerging around May. And this is another plume moth, the Hemp-agrimony plume. It's the smallest plume moth. Very difficult to identify if it turned up in your trap, and obviously you'd need a decent amount of food plant nearby for it to do so. So again, it's a pretty good way of being able to easily identify and record the species. Another species that forms a gall is a recent arrival within our region. First Lancashire and Cheshire records of Mompha bradleyi were in 2011. This species forms a gall at up in the sort of flowering stems of Great Willow-herb, Epilobium hirsutum. And you can see in the top left, there's an exit hole with the epidermis largely unbroken. And the larva feeds in there, again, pupates in there. When the adult emerges, it breaks the epidermis, and then the gall and the hole are much more obvious. And that's the adult moth down in the bottom right. It's quite similar to a few other Mompha species, such as Mompha divisella and Mompha jurassicella. So again, a very good way of recording this particular species and realizing that the adult is Mompha bradleyi than one of the other possibilities. There's a few other species that form galls. One of them is one of the confusion species, one of the confusion species for Mompha bradleyi is Mompha divisella. And this feeds in the stem of various willow-herbs. In this case, I think it was broad-leaved willow-herb. But these form a gall right down at the base of the stem. The larva itself is a much more contrasting moth than Mompha bradleyi, with white areas rather than, a white-coloured thorax rather than buff-coloured. That's much more obvious in the newly emerged moth. The photos in the centre show galls of Mompha sturnipennella on Rosebay Willowherb. The left one of those two shows a stem with 5 galls in it. So yeah, you can get multiple larvae in this. And it's probably easiest to record at this time of year in winter. I mean, the moth's long gone, the larva's long gone, but obviously the evidence of the gall is still there. With most of the leaves and obviously the flowers have all dropped off. You can really check the stems. It's a bit easier to see what you're looking at. On the right-hand side is Cydia servillana. The larvae here create a relatively slender gall in young sallow twigs, and the larva overwinters within. It's mainly a southern species, although there are a few records from Midlands and Yorkshire, so it may turn up in the northwest relatively soon. Fruits and seed pods. So obviously these are another great source of nutrition for larvae, and most of these larvae, as befits, I suppose, the time that fruits and seed pods appear, most of them feed in late summer and autumn. They'll generally then leave the fruit to overwinter in a cocoon amongst the debris and leaf litter beneath. Some of these have quite a bit of economic importance for fruit growers, and so have been blessed with a common name in use for many years. So the top photo shows the plum fruit moth here feeding in a sloe berry. There's you can usually see a tiny little hole on the sloe, maybe a little bit of frass escaped, but most of the frass is inside the sloe, which means that if you give the sloe a gentle squeeze, it feels markedly different to the sloes that have been, you know, unattacked. It just feels softer with more of a give, so you know which ones to open. And yeah, this is a pretty common species, really. But I don't think it is particularly attracted to light. I know there's been some work with pheromones, probably by the very same fruit growers, to try and attract the moths and presumably dispose of them before they have chance to, before they have chance to infect their crops, because it's not only sloes, they also feed on plums as well. In the middle is one of the acorn-feeding larvae, Hemp-agrimony Plume. Yeah, it's a few species that feed on acorns, but this one's a really distinctive larva, nice spotty thing. And down at the bottom is the larva and the feeding signs of the codling moth, Cydia pominella on apple. I think codling is an old English word for cooking apples. And yeah, this can be quite destructive to various crops. I don't think it's not only apples, they can also feed on plums and I think quince and pear, other things. These three are all very common species. You should be able to find them really wherever you are. Other larvae will feed in seed pods, and certainly opening up seed pods will show evidence of larval feeding. It's not only, of course, well, really with all these feed signs, it's not only Lepidoptera larvae that you might find in there. Some afflicted seed pods will contain particularly dipteran larvae. Vetches are particularly used by tortured larvae, such as the pea moth, another one with economic importance, hence it's been given an English name, and that's Cydia nigricana. The one photographed here on the left is Glyphipterix lunulana, which feeds on various vetches. I think this one is on Lathyrus linifolius, bitter vetch. Will also feed on tufted vetch, meadow vetchling, and on garden pea as well. And the larva stays within the seed pod whilst it feeds, and you can sometimes make out because whilst other seed pods have opened up and twisted and dispersed their seeds, seed pods that are tenanted with a larva will be spun shut. So ones that are closed when all the others have opened are worth investigating. They may contain a larva. On the right-hand side is really quite distinctive feeding sign. This is of a moth called Mompha subistrigella. This feeds within the seed pods of various smaller willow-herbs. I think this one's broadleafed willow-herb, and it causes the seed pods curl round. This one's particularly dramatic in its curl. It's sort of loop-the-loop. And inside is this really nice sort of pink candy-striped larva. Okay. Another source of food material for the developing larva, particularly this time of year actually, are catkins. You can find catkins now on birch and on alder, and these two species in particular hold quite a lot of various moth larvae. This is just one example, Argyresthia goidatella. There's a close relative, Argyresthia brocchiella, which annoyingly also feeds on birch and alder catkins at the same time of year and looks pretty much the same in the larval form. The adults are separable. I think some of the textbooks do say that this species enters and leaves the catkin through a hole in the side of the catkin, whereas Argyresthia brocchiella leaves via a hole in the tip of the catkin. But I'm honestly not sure just how reliable that is. I would rather rear these through to be sure which one I've found. There's also a number of Tortrix larvae that feed within catkins. A very common one is Epinotia immeundella, which I showed a photo of earlier. That feeds in birch catkins and alder catkins. Birch and alder, two trees that are closely related, hence they do share quite a few of the same. Quite a few caterpillars will feed on both plants. Epinotia demaniana is another Tortrix larva that feeds in catkins. And there's also Epinotia ramella and Epinotia bilunana, both of which feed in birch catkins and are fairly common. And there's Epinotia tenerana, which typically feeds in hazel catkins. I think it can also feed on alder. But yeah, generally I've only found it in hazel. These are not too bad to rear. They'll usually come through fairly quickly, which is handy because the catkins go off really quickly. So they do take a bit of care. You need to, if you're going to try and rear these through, I would keep them in a small pot, something like this, 7 by 7 millimeter plastic pot, a bit of paper towel on the bottom. Just put a small amount of food plant in and change it regularly, clean the frass out regularly, and hopefully you'll be able to get the larva to proceed to pupate and reach adulthood, and then obviously you'll be able to confirm the identity. So that's just a sample. There's actually many more species that feed within various catkins. There's quite a lot of macro-moth larvae that feed in catkins as well, particularly in their early instars. Sallow and poplar catkins are very good for that. Things like brick larvae and redline quaker will feed within those. And slendpug feeds on sallow catkins. A number of species will feed in flower heads in summer, and there's usually some abnormal signs in the flower head that can lead you to suspect that a particular one might be tenanted by a larva. You may see a few florets pushed up in the centre of the flower. You may see evidence of silk and frass, maybe premature aging of that particular flower head, especially if you look at the other flower heads around it. And sometimes the seeds are retained as they're trapped in the silk that's produced by the larva. The one photographed here is something called Phycetodes saxicola, which is a pyralid. Again, it's a common moth, and it is actually one that will turn up at the moth trap. However, unfortunately, there is another species, Phycetodes maritima, which is essentially identical. And so if it was to turn up at your moth trap, there's only one way of finding out which species it is, and that's by dissection. Whereas if you rear it from the larva, it's very easy to tell because actually the larvae are completely different. They both feed on similar plants, on ragwort, tansy, and related plants. Yarrow is a common one. But whereas this species has the dorsal sort of pinkish line and subdorsal pinkish lines, the Phycetodes maritima is just a brownish colour all over. Not as delicately marked, and the latter species, maritima, also feeds in a big web with 3 or 4 larvae present, usually involving lots of flower heads. So yeah, if you want to identify the species, best way is via the larva. So yeah, one of the signs that a larva is present is by raised florets, and this particular species here is a really good example of that. This moth belongs to the Glyphipterix family, which is another quite large micro-moth family, then with about 100, 120 species. So yeah, this caused the florets in the centre of fleabane to be raised. And if you see that, you know there's a larva present. And it's pretty easy to spot, certainly if you're looking for it. I don't think it's actually a species that we've had recorded in Lancashire or Cheshire. These examples were found somewhere in the Llŷn Peninsula in Wales. And so the larva you can see in the bottom left was feeding right at the base of the flower. And pretty quickly, the adult emerges. It's not an adult moth I'd ever seen before. So really nice, nicely marked moth. So glad to see it. Probably a more subtle sign is the one formed by this another Galechiid moth, Metzneria aestivella, and this feeds in carline thistle flower heads. You can just about see in that thistle head there's really raised florets, and it's just a bit dirty and a little bit of silk in there. But yeah, it is pretty subtle. You may open some up and not find anything, but it gives you an idea which ones to check. So taking care, because it's a pretty prickly customer, grab the flower head firmly and just pull it open in half, preferably over a container, because it may be that the larva drops out. The larva feeds in a tunnel underneath the seeds and overwinters in that position, pupates within the flower head with the adults emerging in spring. Close relatives, Metzneria feed in knapweed flower heads, and Metzneria lapella feed in, have I got these the right way around? Yeah, I have. Metzneria lapella feed in burdock flower heads. Do tell me in the chat if I've got this the wrong way around. I don't think I have. Okay, so larvae of many Lepidoptera, and perhaps particularly the larger species from the Galechiid, Tortrix moths, the pyralids and the crambids, but others as well, will feed in these leaf spinnings. So obviously these are signs that you're more likely to find when there's actually leaves around. But there are still a few species that feed on some of the evergreen leaves, particularly polyphagous species, ones that feed on a wide variety of foodstuffs. Things like Epiphyes postfitana, the light brown apple moth, Andicula angustiorana, red-barred tortrix. I'm sure most gardens will have larvae of these species, which you probably find now. Things like privet, ivy, really any species that's kept its leaves over winter, bramble, lavender. Anyway, the example shown here is something called Anacampsis populella. Here it's on grey sallow, Salix cinerea, but it also uses many other poplars, sallows and willows, and the larva rolls the leaf from side to side and secures it by these silken sutures that you can see in the photo. You'd be pretty brave to record any species, I think, just from its spinning, without at least wanting a little bit of a look at the larva. There might be the odd exception, but yeah, I would generally want to see the larva as well. This is a fairly distinct, nice greenish larva with these big black pinnacula, the spots that are on it. The moth itself is pretty plain, and if it was to turn up in your moth trap, there's another confusion species, Anacampsis blatariella, that makes similar spinnings on birch. The adults of the two are pretty difficult to separate, and in truth would probably need to be dissected. So it's another advantage to rearing through. For many species, the type of spinning is really specific for that species. So these are really two closely related Tortrix moths, which, as you can see, look pretty similar. Each moth is variable, so again, it would probably need to be dissected if it turned up in your trap. On the left is Epinotia salandriana, and on your right is Epinotia brunnichana. Both of these will form spinnings on birch. However, the direction in which they spin varies and is consistent for each of the two species. So Epinotia salandriana will roll the leaf from side to side, securing it again with silk. And the species on the right, Epinotia brunnichana, rolls the leaf from tip to base. So yeah, that's quite a nice little biological quirk of the two. Some larvae take, I suppose, the spinnings a bit further and really go mad with the silk and form webs. Sometimes these webs will host a single larva. For instance, the one that's photographed in the top left is Swammerdamia caseella, whose larvae make a web on the upper surface of a birch leaf. You can often find this in mosses and heaths and similar habitats. Yeah, so it makes this web on the top of a birch leaf, and the larva feeds in there, and it windows areas of the birch leaf as it feeds on the upper epidermis. If it's exhausted the nutritional potential of a leaf and needs to feed a bit more, it can descend onto a neighbouring birch leaf and repeat the process. Now, and just below the web, there's a photo of the adult. Down at the bottom is the adult of the bird cherry ermine moth, Myelois evonymella. And this is one of the small ermines. The small ermines make larger communal webs. They may be up to perhaps 30 centimetres in width in normal circumstances. They tend to feed on a particular food plant. So the bird cherry ermine, like this, feeds on bird cherry, the apple spindle ermine, and the willow ermine. I'm sure you can guess what they feed on. And there might be 50 to 100 larvae present in a typical web. However, occasionally, depending on conditions and perhaps the amount of food plant that's available, these webs can really run riot. This example of Myelois evonymella, the bird cherry ermine, showed webbing covering absolutely the whole of the tree, every single twig, the whole of the trunk, even extending along the grass verge. This was just a tree growing on a suburban street. So going along the verge, covering part of the curb, and even going onto the tyre of a parked car. It's quite an incredible sight. Larvae could be seen crawling up and down the web, looking without success for suitable food material, because the tree itself had been completely defoliated by the larvae. So it'd be interesting to know how many of them survived. I mean, despite the assault upon it, the tree itself recovered. It's looked a little bit leggier since then. This was on the street in Manchester. And now most summers, it just has the occasional small web amongst the branches, but I've never seen anything like that since. So that was a once in 25-year sort of occurrence. A really common form of feeding methods for larvae, and some really distinctive field signs are the leaf miners. So leaf miners, leaf miners, first of all, come from many orders. It's not only Lepidoptera, so beetles, flies, and Hymenoptera. They all have species where the larva will feed inside the leaf. So leaf miners, the larva is actually feeding between the upper and the lower epidermis. And in most cases, the frass will stay within the mine as well, although in some cases it's able to eject the frass. One of the largest families of leaf miners is the Nepticulidae, with about 100 British species. Altogether, there's about 400 micro-moth species that mine leaves for at least part of their development. Some of these feed communally with a number of larvae within a single mine, or sometimes there's lots of mines on a single leaf, or probably in most cases, there's a single larva and a single larva in a single mine on a leaf. So just one leaf mine per leaf. The three that we can see here are all Nepticulid miners. And the mines that the Nepticulids make can be described as a gallery or a blotch. Now with the gallery mine, which there's three examples here, there's a definite start point, and the larva proceeds as it eats away at the leaf, usually leaving a trail of frass behind it. And so at the start of the mine, there's a shiny black egg that you can see, usually on the underside, occasionally on the upper side. And then there's a path containing frass towards the end point. The path usually widens as the moth proceeds, because it's growing as it proceeds and it needs a bigger space to get through the leaf. And at the end of the gallery, you'll find either the larva or, I suppose, the empty space if it's already left the mine. Here are three examples of gallery miners from the Nepticulid family. On the left is Ectodemia heringella. This feeds on Quercus ilex, home oak, This moth is, well, it's a recent arrival into the country, but certainly into our region as well. I think the first Cheshire records appeared a couple of years ago. As far as I know, it's still not been recorded in Lancashire, but then again, we don't have much home oak out in these parts. But it's always worth, if there's any near you, it's certainly one that's worth looking for. And the larvae are out now, so it's a very early miner, because the plant itself is an evergreen. It's accessible for miners to start eating away at it now. So in fact, these photos were taken from Crewe just before the lockdown started. And in the middle is something called Stigmella nylandriella. This is one of my favourite leaf miners. It's really, I think the mine itself is a really attractive creation. It's quite a serpentine mine that tends to follow the jagged edge of the rowan leaf. And the frass itself is laid down in this zigzag pattern within it. And at the end is a little green larva. So it's really quite distinctive. There is another species, Stigmella magdaleni, which also mines rowan, but generally much smaller mines, and the frass is laid down in a linear method rather than this these arced frass that we have here in this zigzag pattern. And on the right, a really ubiquitous miner. Everyone's got bramble near them, and on that bramble you'll find some mines of Stigmella orella. Can pretty much guarantee that. There's a few other species that mine bramble, but really, if you see this relatively thick lines of frass within it, it's not going to be anything other than Stigmella orella. It's extremely common, but hardly anybody's ever seen it, unless, I mean, I'm talking about the adult moth now. Hardly anybody's ever seen it unless they've deliberately reared one through. As you can see from the adult moth, one half of the wings is golden colour, and the other half is sort of dark purplish, has a dark purplish sheen with a white band across it. But you're only going to see this if you rear the adults, because they're just so small. It's got a wingspan of about 4 millimeters. These are all gallery miners. Now the other common mine that formed by nepticulid larvae are blotch mines. In some mines, the larvae feeds within this large blotch, usually containing frass, but occasionally ejecting it from the mine. The example on the left, Ectodermis subimmaculella, feeds on oak late in the season, well, around sort of October going into November. And it forms a slit on the underside of the mine through which it ejects most of the frass. From caterpillar droppings. Perhaps I should have explained that earlier. And obviously it also provides a facility for the larva to leave once feeding's complete, and the larva descends to the ground and pupates in a cocoon amongst the leaf litter. On the top left-hand photo, you can just about see the larva there, a sort of little greenish affair with a black head, and some of the frass that did remain in the mine. The top photo shows the upper side of the mine, and the photo in the middle on the left-hand side shows the underside of the mine. Not absolutely sure they're the same mine though, but anyway, never mind. In the middle is something called Stigmella plagiculella, and this demonstrates that actually in most blotch miners, they're also gallery miners, because very often in the early instar, the larva will initially create a gallery before the mine morphology changes and opens out. That's really clearly seen in the Stigmella plagiculella. Seen these referred to as tadpole mines. There's this long tail and a big head at the end. This species doesn't make any attempt to get rid of the frass, so it's all there within the blotch. And yeah, it's a common species on blackthorn, also grows on, also find it on plum as well, much less often, I must say. On the right is another leaf miner, not a nepticulid in this case. This is Coptitricha marginia, one of the Tischeria species, another common bramble miner, and this makes these vaguely funnel-shaped blotch mines. You've got to use your imagination, but vaguely funnel. So it's narrow at one end and wider at the other end. and the larva feeds within there. And that's an overwintering species, so you'll find those around now. If you go to look at bramble, probably not as common as Stigmella aurella, but pretty ubiquitous still, I think. And that's one of the adults reared beneath it. All those mines just contained single larvae. Some mines contain multiple larvae. Some leaves contain multiple mines. The one on the left is Incaveria olmaniana, which is quite a good one to show for this talk, because I actually found this on a Tanyptera project day at I think it's Ragwort up in North Lancashire in September. I'd never seen the early stages of this species before, but it was so common underneath oak trees in sort of fairly dark woodland. There were hundreds of them, and this leaf had the most. This one had about 15 larvae, each of which continued to feed, formed a little case from a piece of leaf fragment, and while still in an early instar, left the leaf, surrounded in a case of leaf fragments, and wandered along to feed on other leaves from the underside. So this also demonstrates one thing about sunleaf miners, that they only mine for part of their existence. The ones I've shown you previously mine for the whole of their larval period, but this one, Incaveria olmaniana, only feeds in the early instar as a miner. After that, it feeds from a case. The one in the middle also only feeds in its, also only mines whilst in the early instar. And this is Scythropia crategella that feeds on hawthorn. It's more familiar as a larva within large webs on hawthorn branches, but if you find it in autumn, you can see these communal leaf mines where a lot of the mines, there's a lot of mines on a single leaf and lots of them coalesce, and again, I think there's about 15 or so, maybe more. Anyway, about 15 or so larvae within that hawthorn leaf. That's a really nice miner as well. On the right-hand side is who knows, a crococops, yeah, Brongniardella, feeds on oak, and I think there's about 5 or 6 mines here. And this starts with a small gallery mine, which is like a silvery trail on the upper side of oak leaves. And when it gets to a certain size, all the mines join together and form this big inflated mine within which the larvae continue to feed. And you can find this one in sort of June and July. The larvae, when they're fully developed, really nice looking things with horizontal white and red stripes. The larvae descend again to the ground and pupate amongst the leaf litter. The adult, which is the character in the bottom right, it's quite a ferocious looking beast with its bright red eyes and sharp parts, really impressive looking moth. Again, probably not likely to see one unless you rear one through, so it's well worth doing, I'd say. Yeah, just a few other mines. On the left-hand side is a Galechiid leaf miner, Chrysoesthia drurella, which forms this gut-like gallery on Chenopodium and Atriplex species. The other two show a couple of examples of another large leaf mining family, Gracilaridae and the genus Phyllonericta. Most of these form underside mines, and they're tentiform as the upper side of the leaf is curved upwards. On the underside, there's usually a number of creases. Well, the presence and the number of creases can help to be diagnostic. And some of the adults are really beautiful, as I think these examples show. The one in the middle is Phyllonericta arboris, which forms a large uncreased mine on the underside of oak leaves. There's a few Cheshire records, don't think it's been recorded in Lancashire. On the right-hand side is Phyllonericta trifurcula, a pretty common species that feeds on honeysuckle, and its mine's really distinctive as they can cause twisting of the honeysuckle leaf. It's probably quite an extreme example that I've used on this photograph, I'd say. Definitely worth rearing though. These pupate within the mine. They're really easy to rear. Just collect a few leaves, stick them in a pot, and sometimes following day, it seems, that the adult emerges. And yeah, they're beautiful moths that you're highly unlikely to encounter otherwise. You might get the odd bedraggled specimen turning up at the trap, but often very hard to identify when they appear in that state. Of course, leaves themselves come in all sorts of varieties, and some of the more specialised forms have their own specialised leaf mining larvae, such as some of the pine needle miners. Here's the green larva of Cydestis subfasciella, and a reddish-brown larva, Exotelia dodicella. Both of these two should be around now. If you go to Pine Woods at Ainsdale or elsewhere, you'll almost certainly come across both of these species. On the right-hand side is an example of Elachistidae, about 50 species that feed on grasses, rushes and sedges. This is a nice looking larva, very distinctive, so easy to identify from the larva itself. Well, like a lot of these actually, the larval signs are far more distinctive than the adult moth itself. If that moth turned up in your trap, I think it would have to go and be sent to John to be dissected if you wanted an identification, whereas I think you could very easily identify the mine itself. That's Elachistidae cinereopunctella. Of course, once the leaves are finished, they drop to the ground and form leaf litter. And the leaf litter itself is worth investigating. You can find cocoons, lots of overwintering larvae within the leaf litter, but you can also find specialised species that actually feed on the litter itself. And one example is this example of the long-horned moths, Adelidae, Nemophora dagirella, whose larvae feed within, well, I've only found it within oak leaf litter. Most years when I've had a look, I've usually found a couple or so of these, and it forms this great case from circular and crescent-shaped pieces of oak leaf, and continues to feed. Yeah, the adult on the moth on the right is the female. It's got much shorter antennae than the male, and this was reared from one of the cases that was found here in Chorlton, Manchester. Of course, leaf litter is also a good source for those leaf mines that contain overwintering larvae, such as Tscheria ecobladella on the left, that feeds on oak. And the larva is up within, you can just about see there's a disc in the middle lobe of the oak leaf. And within that disc, the larva will be lying in a C-shaped position, waiting to pupate in spring. Yeah, and below it, that's the adult that emerged. There's a few species that don't really do much mining whilst the leaf's on the tree, and what mining they do is very difficult to spot, and they become much more obvious once they land on the ground and form part of the leaf litter. This species is a really good example of this. So Ectidemia argyropeza mines aspen leaves. Very difficult to spot while it's on the ground, but very difficult to spot while it's on the tree. But when it hits the ground, the green islands develop, making the larval presence much more obvious. The green islands themselves have been found to be due to the activity of Wolbachia bacteria on the larvae, which you'd kind of think bacteria on a larva is probably not that healthy, but it's actually been found that if antibiotics are used to kill the bacteria, then it reduces the incidence and the extent of the green islands and has an adverse effect on adult emergence. So yeah, they're nice ones to look for, but you won't unlikely to find them now. It's a species to look for in late November, even early December. Okay, I suppose related to the spinnings and leaf mines, other species fold over leaves and roll them into cones, which again can be quite distinctive. This species feeds on St. John's wort, Epiblema orogatella. Really nice species, I think, actually in all stages. The very early instar does form a leaf mine on St. John's wort, which you can see in the top left-hand photo. The mine on the right shows the mine. The larva's left that and has moved onto the adjacent leaf and spun a cone. And as it eats away, then the cone itself turns brown, as you can see in the photo below. There's the larva on the right hand side and the attractive adult that emerged. It's a nice sort of bluish grey moth with these big yellow spots. Another specialised type of larval feeding is within cases, and you can look for these now on various flower heads. A really great example is Coleophora argentula, whose larvae feed these cigar-shaped cases that you can find on the dried yarrow heads. It's particularly common, I think, in coastal locations. I think these photos were taken from Formby in Lancashire, where this species is extremely common. And there's one of the Coleophoridae, well, Coleophora argentula below that. Another large family, it's about, I think it's about 90 species, all of which form a case for at least part of their development. In the middle, so it's not only Coleophora moths that form cases. In the middle is a Galechiid species, Thiotricha subocelia, feeds on marjoram and makes a case out of an old floret of marjoram. Funnily enough, doesn't seem to appear in Lancashire and Cheshire, although it does appear to the north, the south and the east of us. So maybe it's just waiting to be recorded. I think that one was actually from Lyme Regis in Dorset. And on the right is an example of another family whose larvae produce cases. This is Psychicasta, one of the Psychidae family. And the photos here show the larva in its case and the male and female that emerged from cases. The male is the one with the wings, and that's actually a live photo. It just rested like that. There's no pin through it or anything. And the photo down in the bottom right is actually, it's not a larva, it's actually the female moth. It's a wingless creature. Basically partially emerges, you know, the moth partially emerges from the case, is mated with, and lays eggs in the case, and that's kind of about it. So its adult life is not terribly thrilling or long lasting, but that's what it does. And the alien style larvae develop within the old case before setting off on their own way and producing their own cases. It's quite, I'd say it's quite a common species, but I must admit in the last few years I found it a lot less so in Lancashire. I don't know what other people's experiences are. If you're really bored, you can start staring at tree trunks. You may find pockets of frass pouring out of the crevices in the bark. These aren't always related to moths, but this feeding sign is. This is reddish brown frass that you can see in the trunks of cherry trees. Probably a little bit early for that, more likely to find it in late March and April. And this reddish brown frass reveals the larva of an Ammonia formosana. I think it's called the cherry bark moth as well. And on the right hand side is more cocoons of Pemeni regiana. These cocoons can be found under flaky pieces of sycamore bark and are really, really common. I think if you find a sycamore tree, you're guaranteed to find these, aren't you? I don't think I've ever found a sycamore tree and not peeled off a piece of bark and found these underneath. And again, stick them in a pot, and all being well, some of the attractive adults will emerge later on in the season. Another strange place to go and look for moths: cemeteries. The sort of plants that are grown there, the lichens on the stones and on the trees can be good sources for certain specialised Microlepidoptera larvae, particularly again species of the Psychidae family. We don't have so many of these up here in the northwest compared to the south of England, but a couple that we do have: Naricea duplicella, that's the one on the fore, and there's the moth on the right hand side. This is actually quite an unusual psychid because both the male and female have wings. I think it's one of only two psychids where this is the case. Most have wingless females. The case of Naricea duplicella is coated with Lepraria lichen and pieces of grit and silk and sand and sometimes even bits of dead insect. The photo in the middle shows the case of Lepidella, where there's circular rings, coloured rings around a cone-shaped larval case. The adult that emerges on the right-hand side, and that's a really strange-looking flea-like creature. Down at the bottom, Buccalatrix thoracella. Yeah, well, there's lots of lime trees in our local cemetery, so lots of these ribbed cocoons of Buccalatrix thoracella. Certain moths are even stranger, feed underwater. This one, the brown China mark, feeds on various pondweeds. The larva initially mines, as in the top right photo, later forming a case between cut-out oval sections of the pondweeds and feeding beneath the surface of the water. Small China mark is similar. This one feeds mainly on duckweed and forms a case, which you can see in the top right. Yeah, does all its feeding underwater, and then the adult emerges. The photo in the bottom right is the water vinia, whose larvae feed on various water plants, and I believe the larva can feed up to 2 meters beneath the surface. It's a common moth, but unfortunately haven't found the larva as yet. There's loads of others. Perhaps I've run on long enough. I maybe shouldn't go through those now. But you can look in birds' nests, bee nests. You can even look at your carpets if you really want, but there's a couple that do feed on those, but hopefully you'll never find those. This one's a common clothes moth on the right-hand side. To rear over winter, I tend to keep them in these big yogurt pots covered with stocking, elastic bands secure it, and keep them in a sheltered spot in the garden and keep your fingers crossed. Various books available. That's volume 1, Micro-Moth Field Tips, and that's volume 2, which I'm hoping will see the light of day this year. Each contains about 180 species and detailed information and photographs on the life cycle and how to find it and rear it. There's other books as well. Lots of great information about micro-moths here in these two. And lots of internet sites, Facebook groups, the Facebook Micro-Moth Field Tips site. We've got over 600 members now, and then basically it's for people to share their own field tips. There's some really good info on there. So that's probably enough. Are we all still there?
Yes. Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed, Ben. That was a real phenomenal introduction. Amazing pictures, great tips there, and it's just I'm just always sort of reminded when with a presentation like this of the micro-moths are sort of a bit more interesting in their life histories than the macro-moths, aren't they? The diversity,
much more,
just, yeah, is really incredible.
Yeah, yes, I'm biased. I think they are much more interesting. There's so much more variety. If you were to do a book of macro-moth field tips, there wouldn't be all that many. I mean, you know, there's a few that feed within stems and a couple with very specialized spinnings, but most just sit on a leaf and eat. It's not all that exciting. So yeah, I think they are much more interesting and varied.
And yeah, that tree covered in ermine moth webs in Manchester, I thought that was something that happened on the continent, actually, my naivety. But yeah, that's incredible that it could happens in this area, albeit very occasionally.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I have only seen it the once, but it was impressive, and it was great. It was one of those examples where everybody was interested. You know, everyone was coming to look at it. Everyone was taking photos of it, sharing it on local Facebook groups, and kids were drawing signs. And one guy even had whose house it was growing outside, an information sheet up in his window about what it all was. So it was the whole community loved it.
Brilliant, and I'm glad that you had a new leaf mine at Crag Woods as well when you were out on one of our days out. That's nice to know. So a question from Mark Butler: is Pamini fasciana found in both sessile and peduncular oak, or does it have a specific preference for the acorn?
I'm sure it's found in both. I'm sure that it is. I do wish I had more specific information to give on that point. I don't know that it's limited to one or the other. It's a common species. So this book, I'm sure, will have the answer. This is the Field Guide to Small Moths of Great Britain and Ireland. 3rd edition by John Langmaid, Steve Palmer and Mark Young, and it's an absolutely fantastic book. It contains masses of information on all of these species, on all the stages of the species, and it's Quercus species, so I'm saying I'm sure it will be both of those forms of oak, and also actually found on sweet chestnut as well. So I think so is the answer. Okay, and then I will have a look as we're going along at people putting their hands up physically or using the symbols as well. Actually, I'll go straight to Jenny then, actually, before we have another question from Mark in my list.
Ben, on my local reserve in Somerset, I've got a lot of Great Willow-herb, and I did find some twisted spirally seed heads, but I couldn't find anything in them. And how did you find the larva?
Was this in the seed pod?
Yes, they were.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So in the seed pods that I found, that had the Mompha subistrigella in.
Yeah.
Well, I basically took the really curved seed pods, brought it inside, opened it up, and within it you could see that some of the seeds had been eaten and replaced by frass, and the larva was in there. When the larva's in its early instars, it's pretty colourless, slightly yellowish looking, and only when it gets towards final development is it that more bright pink looking thing. Of course, in your case, it might have already fed and left. Was there any frass or sign of feeding in there?
No, I couldn't find anything. But,
I wonder if it was caused by something else. Then, whether
I don't know. I'll have another go this year. But thank you. That's it.
Yeah. I've not personally found it on Great Willow-herb, but it might be there.
All right. Thank you. Cheers.
Okay. Very welcome. Nice to speak to you.
Okay. So another question from Mark. I think you may have answered this already to some extent. What are good books, websites, links on how to rear micro-moths for identification?
Oh, well.
Is there a gap in the market there?
Yeah, there probably is a gap in the market. There was a book about rearing moths. It wasn't specifically rearing micro-moths, that was in the Harley books, like a companion volume to the Moths and Butterflies of Great Britain and Ireland. I can't remember the title of it. Or I don't know if anyone else can chip in, or even, it's quite an old book now, but none of the books that I've talked about specifically have a whole lot on reading. There is a small section actually in Phil Sterling's book. That's the one. That's the one, John.
Just holding something up there.
Reading Butterflies and Moths by, is it Friedrich?
Yes.
Thank you. I knew there was a book out there. I must admit, I don't actually have that book, which is a terrible admission, but I should do. I'm sure it's another
expensive but good.
Yeah, expensive book to add to the library. So I have to admit, for rearing tips, I've gone off the advice of friends and colleagues, and some of that face-to-face advice, or things, internet advice. Some of the Facebook groups are pretty helpful for giving good sources of advice. But I'm not sure, for most species, it's not so complicated. You just have to think about what the natural life cycle of that moth would be, what its larvae would normally be doing, and try and replicate that as far as possible. There's certain things that you'll learn, like Phylloneryctus, they're actually pretty easy. You don't need to take that much care with them. Stigmellas are quite difficult. Ectodemias are even more difficult. And for those, it really is essential that you keep the leaf mines and the larvae outside over winter. Otherwise, you're really unlikely to get the adults to emerge. And some coleopteras are the same. They need to be outside, you know, they need to be exposed to the elements and a bit of sunshine in spring for the adult to emerge. So netted pots, like I showed earlier, are pretty useful for that.
Okay. We'll just, I'll go to the question from me, actually.
Okay.
I was making that. So I was just interested to know, because obviously you're in Greater Manchester, aren't you?
Yes.
And so, you know, it's not like you're in a really rural position. So I was just, and you're, you know, we're in Northern England here. So I was wondering, on a typical day, typical winter's day in like today, how many leaf miners could you find in your local area? You know.
Well, do you mean just leaf miners?
Or how many of the field signs could you find in terms of the number of species you could detect?
Yeah, well, I could certainly find, you could probably find somewhere in the region of 10 to 20, I guess. I think if I was just, you know, to have a walk out the back here in the Mersey Valley in South Manchester, then, you know, sometime in January, February, I'd be pretty happy with a haul of 10 to 20 species. Depends how long. There'd probably be a bank of about 50, 60, 70 species that I might find. And I guess if I was prepared to stay out long enough in the field, I could find the majority of those. But probably 10 to 20 on a couple of hours walk, I would say.
Well, that sounds pretty productive, much more productive then at the moment than what you could do with a moth trap on finding any moths.
Yeah, much more so. Yeah, if you record, yeah, I mean, if you're into having a list or whatever, but, you know, they're all good records, aren't they? You could easily have amassed a list of sort of 50 species or so if you really went at it at this time of year, which obviously you wouldn't have managed just by looking at what's in the moth trap.
Okay, well, I hope some people will go out and do some walks looking for these micro-moths that you can find at the moment. I'll go on to a question from Rachel Davies, which might have been answered in the chat. This one: can you unroll spinnings to check larvae and then roll back up? Yeah,
well, you can unroll spinnings to look at larvae, and I would really encourage you to do so, because otherwise, what do you have? I mean, there's as I say, there's probably only a few species where you could really, with confidence, identify the species just on the basis of the spinning alone. Generally, a look at the larva, I think, is essential. You may not need to unroll it all the way, but honestly, I found that if I evict the larva from the spinning, photograph it, so I generally photograph the larva, and then put it back in a pot with the leaf, it will make its own way back in. If it needs to reinforce the spinning with a bit more silk, it will do that. And that doesn't seem to have an adverse effect on the adult emergence. It may be that if I was to keep on doing that, obviously each time the larva is producing more silk, it's using up its biological resources, and that then potentially, I suppose, could have an effect. But I think it's kind of essential really to look at the larva in the spinning if you want to be able to identify it. Removing larvae from leaf mines is another matter. That shouldn't really be required, because in a lot of cases you can see the larva perfectly well in the leaf mine anyway. So if you hold it up to the light, it's translucent and you can make the larva out absolutely fine. No need to remove it. In the case of some of them, like the Phyllonericta species, if you take the larva out, it will probably die. If you, and it doesn't really give you, in most cases, it doesn't really give you anything in terms of helping to identify it, because most of the Phyllonericta larvae are pretty similar anyway. There's not, I can only think of one species off the top of my head, perhaps a couple, that have definite, you know, a different colour that would identify as a particular species. If you were to evict it from the mine that's really close to its being ready to pupate, then yes, it might survive, but in most cases it will die. So best avoided with Phyllonerictas. I saw a question pop up earlier about things you need to take when you go out in the field. So, well, you know, the later in the year it is, the more that you need to take. So if I was to go out in the field now, I'd probably take 1 or 2 of these, hand lens, and my camera. And that's probably it. I might, if I was feeling confident, take some of these larger pots as well. And if you're going to a specialised habitat to look for a specialised, you know, a particular species, you might need to adjust that. So if I'm going to look for Elachista larvae, which feed on grasses and sedges and rushes, plants that will generally die as soon as you pick them, I'll always make sure I've got a water bottle handy as well, so I can get the plant up below the roots, something to get the plant up, and then pop it in the water bottle. Just try and keep the plant alive a little bit longer to give the larva a chance to flourish and you know, let the adults emerge in fullness of time. You don't need a right lot. I mean, you can take beating trays and nets and things, but I tend to travel light. If you carry all that stuff around within South Manchester anyway, you're not likely to return home with it. You might end up throwing in the Mersey. So yeah, it makes things much easier.
Okay, well, we have another question from Mark Butler. Is it characteristic of, I think this would be S. orella, Stigmella, is it? Stigmella orella? To mine along the outside of bramble leaves, or is it variable?
It's variable, yeah. I wouldn't say that was particularly a characteristic. They can mine anywhere on the leaf and do so, sometimes in fairly straight galleries, sometimes in really windy serpentine looking galleries. The important thing to note about Stigmella orella is the width of the frass line within the gallery. If at any point it's anything other than a thin linear line of frass, then you're dealing with Stigmella orella. Actually, if it's you know, just a thin line all the way along, it probably still is Stigmella orella, but it potentially is another species. Splendissimella, Stigmella splendissimella, which can sometimes is a much rarer species, but can be found on some of the rubus plants, and the mine of that is, yes, this really narrow line of frass. But orella is so much commoner. If you're in your garden, it's going to be orella.
Okay, a question from Francisco Lopez Nunez. Can we identify the minor only from the mine morphology, or is it the imago, or is the imago always necessary for a reliable identification?
Oh no. In the vast majority of cases, the mine is enough. In fact, the mine is what will give you, you know, what will give you the identification. For instance, with the Nepticulidae, there's 100 species. There's probably only 2 or 3 of them which you could really identify from the imago, from the adult moth. It's the leaf mine, you know, so the plant that's chosen, the shape of the mine, the appearance of the larva, the way that the frass is laid down, perhaps the timing of the mine, you know, all of those features will give you your identification in the vast majority of cases. Yes, sometimes there are some where you would need to rear it through and produce the imago, and probably it would need to be dissected by somebody with a very good eye. But in most cases, that's absolutely not necessary. Now, I'm saying that in the UK, where we've got 100 species. I think the questioner may possibly be outside the UK. I think it popped up earlier, he was from Portugal. But in other countries, they may have far more leaf miners, and it may not be quite as clear cut. But certainly with the UK fauna, most leaf mines are identifiable from the mine alone.
And just on that rearing again, I was wondering, is there any species that have sort of stumped you in terms of how to rear? They're just been so difficult to rear that you've just failed so far.
Oh yeah, there's lots. Yeah, there are. The ones I really struggle with are the Tortrix moths that overwinter as a larva. I find those really difficult. I mean, I think I do all the right things, but the moths don't always oblige. So there's quite a few species actually. The Pamene fasciana, the one on acorns, I've never managed to rear that through. Fortunately, the larva is extremely distinctive. But you know, I've done the right things. I think I've put the tenanted acorn in a large pot with a few other acorns, leaf litter, soil, bits of wood pupating, sterilised the soil, left it outside in sheltered location in a netted pot. Even buried the pots partially in the soil. Nothing. So I'll keep trying. It sometimes takes a few goes before you finally get it.
So there's still plenty to learn then about.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I suppose in truth there probably is that sort of wastage in the wild anyway. I.e., not every larva that's formed in September and October will result in the emergence of an adult in spring. You know, quite a lot of them will fall by the wayside, whether they were parasitized or you know, or they're predated on, or may just fail for, I don't know, viral or other reasons. Conditions weren't right. It's hard to know. All part of the fun.
And I would just mention on rearing, my colleague in the entomology department in World Museum in Liverpool is really into his Ichneumonidae wasps, and there is an awful lot not known about the species they parasitize. So if you are trying and you're from the northwest, he wouldn't be very happy if I was welcoming things from all over the country. But if you're in the northwest and you're trying to rear a micro-moth and a wasp comes out instead, then you could keep it and keep the details, etc., and send it in, and you know, it could be very interesting record which Tony could then identify the wasp. So that's worth mentioning. Okay, on to the next.
Yeah, I should do that.
Do you get lots of wasps, Ben?
Too many.
Too many.
Yeah. It's an occupational hazard of rearing.
Yes. Well, particularly on the less common moths, there's probably not a lot known about what their parasitoids are.
Yeah.
Okay, a question from Kerry Metcalf. Any I think this has come up a few times probably. Kerry Metcalf, and recommendations for good ID info books for a beginner.
Yeah. Okay. Well, if this is identification of field signs, then well, they could buy. There is my book, but I mean the book that I think has really revolutionised and popularised recording of Microlepidoptera is this one. You can see that. So this is the Field Guide to Micro-Moths by Phil Sterling and Mark Parsons, and this came out in about 2012. And this is fantastic. It contains lots of photos of field signs, about 400 photos in there. Half of them are mine, of field signs and larvae. And there's some great illustrations, of course, by Richard Lewington of about 1,000 species of micro-moth. I believe this book, is going to be revamped over the next couple of years, hoping to produce a second edition with a greater number of species and perhaps better photographs as well. So hopefully that's going to be happening sometime fairly soon. But that's a really great book. It's British Wildlife Publications and definitely well worth obtaining. That's probably a good place as any to start. £30.
I think it was something like, I think I remember that coming out. I think it was like 2012 or something. I remember waiting.
Yeah, 2012.
It's a real breakthrough publication, that. And
yeah, definitely.
Okay, a question from Thea Nichols. Thea Nichols, sorry. I think. Is it possible to rear the moths that live on lichens? And if so, how would you do it?
Yes, well, it is, because I have done it. I think perhaps the best tip I can give is to not collect them until as late as possible, which is easier if you're finding it close to home, then you can do that. So by which I mean that they will still be feeding probably late March, early April. So if you were to collect them at the end of January, early February, you've got longer to try and keep the larvae alive. The lichens obviously will dry up very, very quickly. But if you were to say collect them in perhaps the middle of March and put in a little piece of bark with some lichen on from close to where you found the larvae, then fingers crossed you'll be successful. It's always a bit of a lottery, but that should do it. It's absolutely possible, because I've done it with those two cases that I showed up feeding on the lichens in the graveyard. Both of those I've reared through. So and they, at least they do have the advantage of emerging the same season, so you don't need to keep the pot outside. So really, something like this, one of these plastic pots, is adequate for the task. And just keep it inside, keep the pot inside in a dark, cool, sheltered spot. You know, it's on the back of a dark cupboard somewhere, in a shed, somewhere like that. Make sure you keep a close eye on it. You don't want to miss the adult emergence. And ideally, photograph the adult and then release it in the spot where you found the larva. And good luck.
Okay, question just popped up from Ron Moyes. When looking for feeding signs, does it matter if the tree or shrub is sheltered from the elements, e.g. wind, sun, or if a tree should be mature or better a sapling?
Okay, well, all species are different, all right? So they'll all have certain preferences, and if you go into a windswept environment, the species you find will be those that tolerate that very well. However, typically you'll find a lot less species in that type of environment. And similarly, in the middle of a dark wood, you may not find that many species, but those you find, like for instance, the leaf mines of the Incavaria that we found at Cragwood, they were absolutely well suited to that type of location. Typically, I think you will find more leaf mines on the trees on the edge of woods, where it's a bit more light coming in. Typically, I think you'll generally find more mines on saplings than large mature trees, but there again, it's probably a bit of observer bias, because it's so much easier to check those saplings than the ones where the first branch is 2 meters high. So yeah, I think you'll find more species on shrubs and more species in relatively sheltered but still bright sort of areas at the edges of woods. But you will find something everywhere. That's pretty much guaranteed. And they can often be the really interesting ones, you know, because people go to the areas where lots of species occur. The areas where there may only be a few species, it can be really interesting species that you come across.